Hello, and welcome to another episode of Breaking the Guard. On today's episode, I'm going to talk about how to deal with humiliating loss. Right? So, if you've ever suffered just being humiliated on a competition stage or even in training, I will share with you some of this one experience. It was mutual. Both my brother and I suffered humiliating losses at the same time, and how we're able to bounce back from it. Now, this is going to be 25 years ago. It was 2000. I am just about a year into MMA and grappling training, and our coach Randy says, "Hey, look, there's this tournament, state championships or Pan Ams or something like that, that in Orlando. You guys are gonna go and compete there." I'm like, "Oh, okay." And my brother and I were, starting to compete pretty often. So in whatever we could do, we had done a few shoot fights. Uh, we had done some grappling already. So we're like, okay, well, we're down. He goes, okay. Oh yeah, by the way, you're gonna need a gi. So here, I ordered you a gi, and you guys are gonna go in black belt division. And I'm like, oh, okay. Now it turns out it was at IBJJF Pan Americans, right, which was being held in Orlando that year. I believe it was the Pan Americans. I could be wrong, but it was an IBJJF tournament. And I know at the time I didn't think anything of it because, like I said, we weren't training, in a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu school. My instructor was a Cuban American guy. He was good, uh, judo black belt, Japanese jiu-jitsu black belt, taekwondo black belt. He was a true mixed martial artist before the term had even existed. But he wasn't giving us, cultural Brazilian jiu-jitsu, right? So my brother and I didn't realize the major taboo that we were committing jumping into a black belt division without being a quote unquote Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt. And I was 18 at the time. Yeah, I don't think I was. Yeah, I think I was 18. My brother was 19. Sorry, and we're going into the division. So mind you, that would be very young for a black belt, especially in that era, right? Remember, most people were not training from 4 years old, especially in the U.S. And when we go to do the weigh-ins, I remember uh, the people there were looking at us like super suspiciously, right? And we were both in shape and whatnot, so I guess fitness wise wasn't an issue. But like, they never heard of us. They were asking us some questions, and we're like, oh, whatever. To me, it wasn't a big deal as far as competing up a division because in wrestling you do that. When I was in high school, I was competing in men's open divisions, which is for like adults, right? Uh, I never thought anything of it. Like if I want to challenge myself more by going up a division, no big deal. But obviously in jiu-jitsu, it's seen as disrespectful and whatnot. Now, my brother and I probably put in like 3 or 4 sessions training with a gi, and learned just some of the basic collar chokes, P choke, and I don't even remember. Like my gi game is not really there. Uh, so when we go to compete, we are warming up, and I remember people were watching us warm up in awe because we were warming up like wrestlers. We were drilling takedowns and working very explosively. And I remember at that time nobody was warming up that I could see there. They just stepped onto the mat as it was, and the pace was so slow. So anyhow, tournaments progressing. It finally gets to the black belt divisions, and for the most part, the tournament sounds like a wrestling tournament. There's noise going on, and there's occasional chatter here and there, the occasional roar of the crowd as it moves up and down. Uh, Once they call the black belt divisions, I forget if I went first or my brother went first, but I get called onto the mats, and it suddenly goes dead quiet, like you're watching a tennis match. I'm like, okay. So I'm facing this guy, and it doesn't last long, folks. We grab on, match starts, he drops guard, arms guard me immediately, and I tap right away. Like my arm was locked out completely. And I think that was like the quickest loss in my career of all combat sports. It was just so fast. I was like, what the hell? And of course, I'm not familiar with the grips. He was able to grab onto my sleeves, so like it just sucked me into like a really deep armbar, and there was no way of me driving in or pulling out. I was like, oh man, what a freaking scrub, right? Like, I felt like such a schmuck that I got like tapped out. It must have been less than 10, 15 seconds, like it was just super quick. Nothing in the match happened. I just got pulled into guard armbar. I was like, ugh. I'm like, well, I got another match. I'm like, I can maybe redeem myself. My brother goes and he has a match and he also loses. Uh, Not as bad as I did on that first match. I think he just lost by points or something. Then the second match, I'm facing this really big guy, uh, and he's just smothering me. So I forget. I think he's pulled guard or something, then swept me, and then he was mounting me, and then I think he ended up getting me in a cross choke or something like that. At least that one went longer. Like it didn't finish in a minute, you know. But I still just got totally smashed and like definitely did not belong, right? Like I was not at that level, especially with the gi. I think mainly the problem was the gi. It's a very different animal, right? Um, Especially if you just never really trained with anybody decent. Uh, you just are not familiar with the grips or getting whatnot. So I get destroyed both my matches, and then I'm like, well, my brother still's got one more, and then my brother ends up facing the guy that I faced on the first match, and he's having a little bit of a wrestling slash judo match with him, and the guy is setting up like a uchimata as they start going out of bounds. When my brother goes out of bounds, he makes the beginner mistake of kind of stopping, and then the guy throws him at that point. And my brother lands flat on his back on basketball hard court with the guy slamming on top of him, completely knocks the wind out of him. And he's not able to get up right away, and they called it a TKO. Basically, I didn't know they did it in the jiu-jitsu, but he wasn't able to get up quick enough because he was just completely got the wind knocked out of him. I'm like, oh God. And I remember seeing, I'm like, fuck me, man. Like it just did not go well. So like, we both went 0-2 that day, completely with our tail tucked between our legs. And then we just walked out of there. And of course, I was filming because we would film each other's matches. And we were just pretty silent, when we left there because it's just such a slap in the face, right? Like it's like, what the hell just happened here? And we ended up driving to, I think, a Wendy's to get, something to eat. And we're just sitting in the parking lot. We got like our camcorder and we're watching the video just to see what happened, which, like I said, didn't take long. The matches were not long. So we just watched both our matches. We just looked at each other and we just started laughing. I was like, oh shit. And I think I don't think those videos exist anymore. I'm sure somebody's got it somewhere, it's the internet, but at least at our end, I don't think we kept those videos. There wasn't much to learn there. Uh, but we were able to laugh it off. And I think a month later, I was going to compete in another shoe fight. And I was actually rematching the guy that had beat me in my first ever shoot fight. This guy Efren Ruiz, who was really good fighter. I lost to him in double overtime, sudden death in this shoot fight. Uh, so I'm like, I wanted to get that one back in, so I was training really hard for it. And when we went to the fight, It turned out that he wasn't there. I forgot what happened, if he was injured or something, but just no showed. So I'm like, crap. And then the only person that was there was this Brazilian kid that was like destroying everybody. Uh, he was doing grappling, right? But then I guess they announced that I was missing an opponent, and he stepped up. Turns out this Brazilian kid was Pablo Popovich. And at the time, he was a brown belt, but he was obviously a stud. And he looked just as chiseled as, or not as bulky as he got it towards later, but he was my size. Uh, and they matched us up. And what ended up being a great fight, I believe I took him down first. He tried to Kimura me. I reversed. I went for an ankle lock. He escaped. He went for something else. Like, it was a back and forth match, but one of the deciding factors was that this was a shoot fight, so there was ground and pound. There was striking. But it was mostly groundwork because he didn't stay in his feet long. But I was doing a lot of ground and pound, whereas he was trying to just focus on grappling. And the grappling exchanges, as I can recall, were pretty even, but because we both traded submissions. But I was dominating on the ground and pound. So I ended up getting the win in that match, although it was a really difficult match. And the crowd was not very happy with that win. It was a mostly Brazilians in the audience, and as far as uh, my team, it was my brother, me, and my my coach Randy. So we didn't have a lot of backers, right? We are kind of like these outcast people there. So there was a lot of rumbling, and I remember it was like some warehouse gym, and I was just laying on a bench, like totally gassed because it was a really tough match, right? And I was only supposed to fight once that day because it was a shoot fight, right? So I'm like, oh, okay, well, I won my match. I'm pretty happy, right? And then my coach is like, hey, Dave, you got one more. I'm like, one more? I'm like, we're sign up for one. He's like, you don't understand. If you don't fight this guy right now, you're going to have to fight a bunch of Brazilians in the parking lot because they're not leaving without blood. I was like, what? And you could hear there was a good rumble in the audience. So I'm like, oh, maybe he's not. And you could tell they were not happy with this decision. So I'm like, all right, who is this guy? And it's like, oh, they point over, and it's some tall Brazilian guy. So I'm like, and I thought he was this guy who was a kickboxer, because I've seen in this same promotion a guy who looked similar, that was just like a Muay Thai fighter. So I looked at him. I'm like, okay, I'll just take him down and I'll ground and pound him, just like the other guy. When I go to fight this guy, he is significantly taller than me. He's got feet like paddle boards. I do take him down, but then he ends up scrambling to my back, and I end up being pretty much shelled up for most of the round. And he's just like elbowing me in the back of the head, which he's not supposed to do. But he starts punching and whatnot, or open handing, or whatever. No, it was close fist. These shoot fight rules. But he ultimately got a rear naked choke sometime into the match and was able to win. And I remember leaving there upset. I'm like, oh, so lame. Like I was just totally fatigued. Like the other guy was much better. I could feel it. And I had people come up to me afterwards. Goes, you don't know who that was? I'm like, no. It's like, oh, that's Minotauro. And this is 2000, right? So I'm like, who the hell is Minotauro? Like, oh, he just fought in rings. He won this and this and that. I'm like, man, I don't know. I thought the first guy was better. But it turns out I fought a young Minotauro, not the brother Minotauro, the original one that we knew, and everyone fell in love with, Minotauro. Uh, and apparently he was just a spectator at the time, but because the Brazilian squad lost with their favorite fighter, Pablo, they ended up recruiting Minotauro and getting him a pair of Balotelli shorts just so that he can fight to defend the honor, I guess. Kind of crazy. But he was not I guess he was probably peer pressured into it just like I was, because he was pretty nice as far as afterwards. And I know I trained with him or his brother not too long after that. But uh, long story short, I went from perhaps one of my most humiliating performances. I know, definitely my most humiliating performance in my martial arts career, to a month later beating one of the top grapplers in the state at the time, and then facing a guy who was a MMA legend, who or at least became an MMA legend, and faring pretty well. And I think a lot of it is just has to do with having the right mindset. When you lose, you can't dwell on the loss and take it personally and feel like, oh, everybody's looking at me with shame, or I embarrass myself and I can never come back from this. That's all BS. You can come back from just about anything. And especially in my case where, and my brother, like, we didn't have any serious injuries. It was just a very strong, uh, perhaps a mental injury, as far as like, oh man, this was embarrassing. But that's only as severe as you allow it to be, right? And I think what my brother and I were able to do, just being seasoned competitors, was we were able to look at that and just laugh at it, right? And like, hey, okay, we got scrubbed that day, right? And move on. And I think being able to do that is so important if you're a top tier competitor, because otherwise, if you just dwell on the loss and you just keep reliving it over and over again, and you don't forgive yourself, or you don't see the learning lesson in there, you're gonna have a hard time moving on. But despite that being one of the most, or like I said, probably the most humiliating loss uh, of my career, it never didn't even phase me for 1 second. Like, I was able to, okay, whatever, I'll move on from it. And I'm wondering about that now, because I mean, it was such a bad loss. Like, I have never lost like that ever again, that badly. And I don't know, maybe because I was in the gi, and I'm not a gi guy, so I was able to say, oh, different sport, whatever. But I don't think it was that. I just think that the shared experience of getting smashed alongside my brother, and both of us just being able to laugh it off, kind of relieved any, internal guilt, or, you know, any feeling of blame that I would have placed on myself, and just realized you had a bad day, you didn't prepare properly for this, you underestimated the difficulty of it, and this is what happens when you do that. And it's like, okay, lesson learned. Uh, because I've lost other matches where, like, I definitely dwelled in it a lot more, and like thought about them and relived them over and over again. I thought, man, if I would have done this instead of that, everything could have been different. But those matches, never really thought about them too much. I mean, I know the mistakes I made, and I'm like, okay, I only had to play it in my head like once or twice. I'm like, I got it now. Like, I understand what went wrong. Versus sometimes when you have a hard loss, it's like you see it over and over and over. Uh, and this is where that saying I like to use, which is less is more, is key here, right? Like, reliving something for weeks and months or even years is not helpful, right? Like, you got everything you could usually after one or two times, right? Especially when it's something that's difficult, you're probably paying a lot more attention to it than the average person is. So your playthroughs are much more intense. So it's not like I'm not that interested, so I have to watch or reread a book over a few times until it really sinks in. Like, no, when you lose in a harsh way, like, it is a really you're fixated because you're trying to figure out what went wrong, and then there's a part of you also that's kind of fantasizing about like how things could have changed uh, if you would have played your hand differently. And I would definitely tell you here, less is more, right? And I think watching a video with a third party to review a match that's troubling you is useful here because they'll give you some outside perspective, and the learning lessons can be picked up immediately. And then we can just, okay, we're done with this. We don't have to keep looking at this again. We we picked out the parts of this match which could have been improved, the parts that you did well, and now we know what we have to work on in training. And that's it. I think that's a good practice, and generally what we do with our fighters, even whether they win or they lose, uh, it's good to review matches and review tape. My brother is a big proponent of this, which I agree, which is before you review tape, always review memory first, especially as the fighter, because chances are the things that you remember are going to be pivotal parts of the match uh, that really stuck out to you. So it's good to go through those parts first, and then resort back to video and for the gaps in between what you don't remember, which in most cases it's a good amount of a fight, um, and then work through it that way. But I share these with you because actually I'll share with you one more, and this is when I was saying my most humiliating loss. I'm like, well, in martial arts, because I did have one wrestling match where I lost that was super humiliating to me. Uh, and this was also the one time I cut a lot of weight. And this is what I say. Normally, when you have bad turnouts, it's normally multiple things going wrong at the same time, right? Just like any type of disaster, it's not just one event that makes it, right? It has to be a cascade of bad things rolling up and snowballing together to become a huge event that becomes a disaster, right? Otherwise, it'll just be a small mishap. But when you have a disaster where you like in competition scenario, you're super underperforming, or you have a severe accident or whatnot, that is something that is a culmination of mistakes. And in my case, I was competing in high school wrestling, 171. This was my junior year, and I was finishing practice really low on weight, and I think I was like finishing and weighing in at 165, and then the next weight class would have been 160, 160, right? I'm like, man, that's just 5 pounds, and I'm not even trying to cut weight right now. It's like I could definitely make it, and I was kind of telling my coach that. My coach was like, and then at one point he's like, fine, if you want to do it, do it. And I was like, no, okay. And I fell into that same trap that everybody does. Like, oh, if I can lean out more, I'm gonna have more of a strength edge or whatnot. Well, it turns out those last 5 pounds were pretty tricky to get off, right? Um, and we had a try meet where basically in wrestling, you're not only facing one team, you're gonna face like two teams. And I think in our case, it might have even been three teams. I'm not sure. I can't recall correctly if it was two or three teams that we were facing. But uh, anyhow, it was in the west coast of Florida. And I remember I finished training that day. And, it's like 6 o'clock at night when we get back home. I'm 165. And then I'm trying to basically sweat off the rest of the way. And it was my first time really cutting any serious weight. And of course, I did everything wrong. I was, trying to spit out, all my sweat, didn't drink any water, didn't eat anything. And I remember waking up at 3 in the morning and then jumping rope in the garage. And we ended up having to drive out around like 6 a.m. And I wasn't the only one who was also suffering. I know my brother was cutting weight and he was suffering. And then a couple other guys in the team were suffering. So we had to make this drive. And, although it's Florida, it was like, it's winter Florida, which for everybody else, like, that's not cold. But for us, it was. And harder to sweat when it's like, cold 60s. Again, I say cold, but in Florida, it definitely feels colder because of humidity. So everybody's pretty much sitting in their car with the heater on, trying to, in the plastics and whatnot, trying to sweat. And the whole team had a real rough go of it, but we eventually all made weight. And I made another classic beginner mistake, which is I just chugged on Gatorade. And I think I had like a half gallon of Gatorade, like in one sitting, and a bunch of like wheat thins and lots of carbs, Chex Mix, just total garbage food when I look back at it. And it hit like a freaking rock. Like I remember after I just gorged myself to try to replenish my fluids and get some energy in me, I felt so sick and nauseous. And again, I wasn't the only one. My brother was passed out. Like as the dual meet started, people were competing, and it seemed like a whole team was getting slaughtered. Like it was just so poorly prepared, right? Like we shouldn't have like just driven there that morning, right? Like we should have probably driven there the night before, and been able to sleep well. So anyhow, just total disaster. I remember when I came up, I ended up facing the state champion uh, of the region, or I guess because there's like 6A, the different like kind of like there's a wrestling D3, D2, D1. The Florida states has similar breakdowns. So I was facing one below where I normally compete at, but he was the state champ, and I go up there, immediately get head on throat. Just like match starts, like 1, 2, 3, poof, and he puts me on my back. Now, this is before I really knew any submissions or whatnot, but at the time, this guy was cranking his head and arm so tight, and he also, I believe, had my arm crossed over, that it was like an arm triangle. So I was trying to bridge to keep myself from getting choked. I mean, for getting pinned, but I was feeling choke pressure, but I didn't know how to describe it. So I started telling the ref I can't breathe. And what really I meant is that I'm being choked, right? Or, strangled, if we're using Danaher terms, right? But the ref just totally ignores any of my complaints. I'm like, ah, and I think I said it a couple times, like, I can't breathe, I can't breathe. And then eventually, boom, sticks me. And when the match ends, the referee looks in my eyes and goes, "You're a liar." I'm like, "What?" He's like, "If you couldn't breathe, you couldn't talk." And I was like, and I just felt so embarrassed. Like this guy called me out, and like in my 16-year-old head, the logic seemed fallible. Like it seemed correct. Like yeah, if you were being suffocated, you wouldn't have anything to say, right? Like you would need all the air you couldn't breathe. It's only later on I realized, no, I was getting arm triangled. So yeah, like what I meant to say was that he's choking me, or strangling me or whatever. But I remember leaving that match, I'm like, oh God, just like so embarrassed that I got pinned, and that one was probably less than a minute also. And then my very next match, I faced the guy who took second in states in that same thing, and he teched me just 15-0. Totally just wiped the match with me. I was like, what the hell, man? It was just a rough day at the office there. But that's another one of those where, again, I felt perhaps because it was shared humiliation, because my brother also got destroyed and most of our team just got wiped. And we just kind of laughed it off and then competed again the next weekend, and like nothing ever happened. And I feel being able to brush off these losses is so important if you're going to be a good competitor. And if, honestly, if you're going to be a good student of the game. If every time you take a loss, it's like you're again in a crying fit and you start like punching the walls and you have to like isolate yourself for like a couple weeks and not show up to practice. Like, you're not going to grow at the same rate as anyone else who has a healthier approach to loss, right? At the end of the day, losing is just a sign that mistakes were made and we have to recalibrate. And whatever lessons that we can learn, we learn, and then go into practice and work those things out. Don't take it any harder than it has to be. At the end of the day, we are playing a silly game, right? We're grown adults trying to simulate murder on each other. You know, uh, don't take it too seriously, right? Especially for grappling. Although, to be fair, grappling nowadays is probably a bit more dangerous than MMA is just because the joint locks are so severe now that it's like, man, you can blow out your knee pretty easy nowadays. Uh, and MMA, like the worst thing that's probably going to happen to you is getting a concussion. Again, it isn't great, but I'd rather get a concussion than get my knee torn apart. I've done both. A concussion, at least you wake up and you don't remember much and you feel okay afterwards. Your knee getting torn apart doesn't feel the same uh, ever, right? So, yeah, I think the scales have definitely shifted quite a bit now with how prevalent the submission game is. And I think a lot more people are being a lot more stubborn and not tapping, which is not great. Anyhow, I share this with you guys just because I think that it's important to understand what a good mentality is for absorbing a loss and then bouncing back from it. And that first story in particular, I felt was a great bounce back because, like I said, suffered a pair of humiliating losses, and then a month later, had one of my best early victories. And then, even though I lost the second match, it was a good performance by me. So, uh, I think some people, when especially when they lose, like the way I lost, they retire right there. Especially if you're a young competitor. I've seen people, they do their first tournament, they lose quickly, and they just quit, never show up again, right? And that's sad, right? Because that means the loss actually became you, right? And instead of just being something that happened to you, uh, it's important to be able to come back from these and to show up and continue to persevere in the face of obstacles. So hopefully none of you ever have to suffer humiliating losses, but the reality of life is chances are at some point you will, but it's okay, right? I think the one thing's important is that to understand is that whatever you feel as humiliating or embarrassing that you might think is unique to you, but it isn't. Like everybody has suffered this in some shape, way, or form. It's part of being human, right? Maybe they didn't lose by a flying armbar in 5 seconds, but maybe they got dumped by a girl in front of the whole class, in a very embarrassing way. Like there's some type of embarrassment that has happened to somebody before, So that feeling that you may have is not unique, and if you learn how to lean into it, and like I said, you can laugh about it, it's gonna make your life a whole lot easier, and you'll be able to move on from these things much quicker. And if you're able to move on from it, that means you're also able to learn from it. So that's all I have for you guys today. Keep it a little bit on the shorter side. Hopefully, you guys picked up something from that. Where if you ever do suffer a big loss, you can bounce back from it. And if you need help with it, send me an email. I'll laugh at it for you. All right, guys, take care.